All right, let's get back to Plato and Phaedrus. All right, so Phaedrus says, okay, obviously you're going to have to helicopter again. I want to get you guys a good shot of a helicopter if one comes overhead. I feel like it's exciting. I don't see it yet. Well, all right, sorry about that. Okay, so Phaedrus says, enough. I see I have no hope of practicing my art upon you. But if I am to read, where would you please to sit? And Socrates says, let us turn aside and go by. This is a river. We will sit down at some quiet spot. Phaedrus says, I'm fortunate in not having my sandals. And as you never have any, because Socrates is quite poor and doesn't even have shoes, I think that we may go along the brook and cool our feet in the water. This will be the easiest way at midday, and in the summer is far from being unpleasant. It's nice outside. They're going to take a walk outside by the river. Lead on, and look out for the place where we can sit down. Do you see the tallest plane tree in the distance? Yes. Well, there should be shade and gentle breezes on grass on which we may either sit or lie down. We'll move forward. I should like to know, Socrates, whether the place is not somewhere here at which Boreas is said to have carried off Orythia from the banks of the Ilissus. Well, such is the tradition. And is this the exact spot? A little stream is delightfully clear and bright. I can fancy there might be maidens playing near. So one of the first things, so they're just looking for a spot to sit down. And Lysias says, is this the place from mythology where the god of the wind fell in love with this girl and stole her away? So they're talking about mythology, and again, you can Google search that. You can Boreas. That one actually might be interesting to look up Boreas, and that's the god, sort of the god of the winds, I think. Um, it's not super. This is again one of the things I should tell you guys about. Really important. Um, there's not going to be any tests on Plato exactly. I mean, you have to write essays where you tell me your opinion on Plato, but there's not going to be like a quiz where I go, who is Boreas and what's the name of the river that Socrates and Phaedrus sit down by. You're never going to get questions like that. You'll have to write essays on Plato, but you can have Plato out right next to you while you write them. It's not like I'm going to take the book away from you. You're allowed to have Plato near you. I don't need you to memorize this stuff. So if there's little things in here that you miss or get confused about, don't get stressed about it. I know, it's just they're referencing mythology, and we can look it up or not. I don't think it's super important to us. But Socrates' response is kind of interesting, though. Um, um, Socrates says, I believe the spot is not exactly here, but about a quarter of a mile lower down where you cross the temple of Artemis, and there I think is some altar to Boreas at the place. I've never noticed it, but I beseech you, and I really want you to tell me, Socrates, do you believe that tale? And this is something interesting. So they're talking about, basically, Phaedrus' question is, oh, I heard there was like a god that came down in the wind and stole this girl. Do you think that's true? Because they're talking about whether mythology is true or not. And Socrates has an interesting opinion about this. So Socrates says, the wise are doubtful, and I should not be singular if, like them, I too doubt it. Meaning smart people are never really sure about stuff like that. He says, I might have a rational explanation that Orythia was playing with Pharmacia when a northern gust carried her over the neighboring rocks, and this being the manner of her death, she was said to have been carried away by Boreas. So he says, listen, I know mythology says the god of the wind came down and stole her because she was so beautiful, but maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe she was playing, and a gust of wind knocked her off a cliff, and she died, and people just said that the god of the winds thought she was so beautiful that he took her away, right? So Socrates is a rational thinker. He's not, well, that's actually not true. We'll find more about that later. But right now, Socrates is saying he doesn't believe all that bullshit mythology. And he says it's probably a simpler explanation. It's not that he believes or disbelieves. He doubts. Socrates wants the truth. And he's not sure the story about the god swooping down and stealing the girl is true. So he thinks he's not sure. He wants something he can be really sure of. And this is interesting. Because, as I pointed out, remember rhetoric? The problem with rhetoric is it's persuasive speaking and writing, but is it true? So here is a story of exactly the kind of type we're talking about, which is that this girl, maybe she was stolen by a god, or maybe she just got blown off a cliff and died like a regular person. Socrates wants to know what's true, and so he's not just going to believe the myth, even though the myth is fun to believe, it's interesting, it's persuasive maybe in some ways, it's because it's exciting and cool, but Socrates, he's not sure because he's interested in the truth, and he's worried about the way that people will tell stories, use words, to say things that aren't true and get people to believe them. Boy, there are a lot of helicopters out here. All right. Where's that helicopter? Go over my house. Where is it? All right. I don't see it. So Socrates has some more to say on this subject. He says there's discrepancy, however, meaning something doesn't quite fit, about the locality. People aren't sure exactly where this happened. According to another version of the story, she was taken from. Can I tell you something? I'm really bad at pronouncing these things. You could look it up, by the way, how to pronounce this stuff. I'm just going to keep scrolling it up. Um, and she was taken from somewhere else and not from this place. Now, I quite acknowledge these allegories are very nice. An allegory is like a fancy story that's used to kind of express a simpler thing. So, for example, if a girl falls off a cliff and dies, that's if the wind knocks a girl off a cliff and dies, that's the truth. But you could make an allegory of it. It's like a fancy story about how the god of the wind took her away. Um, so he says these allegories are very nice, but he is not to be envied who has to invent them. Right, meaning coming up with all these stories must be a terrible job. He says, much labor and ingenuity will be required of him, and when he has once begun, he must go on and rehabilitate hippocentaurs and chimeras dire. So he says, like, he says, I feel bad for people that make up stories like this, because once you start making up a story, once you believe one crazy thing, you got to believe 100 crazy things. He mentions monsters, chimeras, and hippocentaurs, but you could just think about like Pegasus or a unicorn. His point is that once you start these kinds of stories about how the god of the wind came down and stole this girl, then you're going to end up believing any crazy story because none of them have any proof. So you might want to think about, in our modern day terms, just to give an example of this kind of, remember I said one of the things you got to do is you got to quote and discuss and use modern examples. So a simple example of this would be conspiracy theories. Once you believe in one conspiracy theory, it's very easy to believe in hundreds of them because none of them have any proof, right? So if you think like the government is trying to, that COVID, for example, is a hoax created by the government to keep people indoors. Once you believe that, it's not true, by the way. Once you believe that, you can believe in tons of crazy things. Oh, cell phones are giving people viruses. Doesn't make any sense. Right, or there's all these secret shadow government that's controlling blah 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 blah, and people will believe all kinds of crazy stories. So Socrates is very interested in the truth. He wants to know what's true, and he says, "Boy, if you believe one crazy story, you start to believe them all." And again, we could look up what hippocentaurs and chimeras are, but they're mythical creatures. You might want to just replace these words in your mind with unicorns and Pegasus. Pegasus is like a horse with wings. And the hippogriff is like a horse with wings with an eagle head. If you know Harry Potter 3, there's a hippogriff in Harry Potter. The point is they're like magical beings that aren't real. And he says once you just believe one crazy thing about how the god stole this girl, then you end up believing in all these fictional monsters. Gorgons, that's another kind of monster from mythology. Gorgons and winged steeds flow in a pace. Right? Once you believe one thing, all these monsters, hippocentaurs, chimeras, gorgons, horses with wings, they all start to come into your brain. And numberless other inconceivable and portentous natures. And if he is skeptical about them, skepticism is when you're not sure something's true. If you're skeptical, you're sort of saying, well, I'm not sure that's right. And Socrates is very skeptical. Actually, he practically invented skepticism. Skepticism is when you hear something, you don't immediately believe it. You don't immediately disbelieve it either. You just kind of go, well, maybe. That's the classic skeptic. If you want to be a skeptic, when someone says something, you go, maybe that's true. I'm not sure that's true. Socrates is the most famous skeptic. He's like the original skeptic. He's the original guy who's going, I don't know if that's right. Because he wants to find out the truth. And if you just believe anything anybody tells you, then you're going to fall into error and get all confused. Notice, by the way, this conversation about mythology, do you see how this links up to Lysias? Because Lysias was saying crazy stuff, right? Lysias was the one who was saying you should be in love. They're about to sit down and discuss a speech about why you should be in a romantic relationship with somebody who doesn't love you. That's crazy. But see, Socrates is saying, maybe don't believe crazy things. Because once you believe something crazy, you start believing piles of crazy things. And right now, they're just talking about mythology. But in a second, they're going to sit down and talk about the speech of Lysias. And I got to tell you, the idea of like marrying someone because they don't love you seems just as crazy to me as believing in unicorns. Those both seem like terrible ideas. So there's a link here between Lysias's craziness and the craziness of mythology. So we'll pick that up in the next video.